that is going over a certain piece of equipment. So you'll notice that above the atmospheric chemical tanks, these probably chemical tanks containing a class 1 liquid, these chemical, and that means that the liquid is flammable under 100 degrees F. And so you can see that there's a vent above these tanks that creates a class 1 div 1 area. And we will learn later that a class 1 div 1 area is an area where you're expecting hazardous gases in ignitable concentrations to be present normally. And that would be the case, that you would agree that a tank with flammable chemical will typically vent flammable gas. And so yes, you can understand why that would be a class 1 div 1 area for 10 feet, and that's the double hatching. And then you'll see an adjacent area, which just means the area next to a class 1 div 1 area is division 2. And you can kind of understand that as you move away from the source, the chances of you having an ignitable concentration of that hazardous gas decreases. So they call this a division 2 area. A division 2 area is by definition an area where gas is not normally present but can be. And that's a 10-foot radius from the point source of the vent on the chemical tank. So that's just to give everyone a good idea of what we're talking about, but we'll go more into the specifics of the definitions of class 1 and classifications and divisions and even zones. So it's important to know that, okay, you're looking at this drawing and you're seeing that there's only 2 different designations for the divisions. There's division 1, which is double hatching, and division 2, which is single hatching. And so I can know just by looking at this drawing that this platform was classified to API 500 specifically. So it's a choice that an operator can make. They can classify their platform either to API 500 or 505. Both are incorporated in 198 in the regulations, and also mentioned several times in subpart H and in 250.114. So they could choose any document to classify their platform to, 505 or 500. You know that if they only show 2 different divisions, 1 and 2, that they're using 500. And if they have 3 different divisions, where you would see sometimes they use like first of all, if they were using 505 to classify their platform, you would see 3 different designations, and those are not called divisions, those are called zones. And the zones would be designated similar to this hatch mark, except for one might show a kind of design where it looks like kind of polka dots that are spaced out, and then they would start with the hatching for the zone 1 and zone 2 areas. So, okay, so in general, the difference between 500 and 505 is that 500 shows divisions and 505 shows zones. So why is there a difference? Why are there 2 different documents and 2 different ways to classify your platform? Well, I think the answer is that the European standard, the International Electric Code, IEC, came up with a way to designate or classify a platform, and it had 3 different zones. And it was kind of analogous to API 500, but there was really no way to reconcile a facility that had been designed to the IEE standard if you brought it into America. So thus API 505 was created so that you could have the possibility of a facility being designed for both the European standard and the American standard. So this became very useful, and that's why for like drilling rigs, and that's why you'll see it more on drilling rigs, which have missions overseas and then will have missions in the Gulf. So those are, it's more advantageous and it makes more sense for sometimes a drilling rig or a FPSO to classify their system using API 505, which again would use zones instead of divisions. And the key difference is that there are 3 zones ranging from gas most likely being present to gas least likely being present, zone 0, zone 1, and zone 2. You are not able, in any case, well, except for one, you're not able to mix and match, so to speak. So you're not able to take equipment that is only good for a zone system and put it into a division system. That is, unless you can actually put any zone 0 equipment into a division 2 area, and that's listed specifically in API 14F. So, okay, so without further ado, let's get into the specifics about the key terms that we would need to know for API 500. So when we look at API 500, we're looking at the second edition currently. And the reason why this class is focusing mainly on the second edition is because most platforms and rigs are designed to the second edition. So they were grandfathered in to stay with the second edition, and whenever they have modifications, they continue to use the second edition, so that they didn't have to change the entire design of the facility in December of 2018, whenever the reg switched to the third edition. The third edition, we will go over later, has some more conservative classifications where you might have to redesign your facility based on the distance that the third edition would make you put for a classified location. Okay, so in API 500 second edition, we'll look at the definitions, and it's failed on me, so let me reopen that. So sorry guys, but Adobe will fail me a couple times a day, so just bear with me when I reopen these documents. Okay, so the important thing that we're going to go to now is just looking at the table of contents. And this is one of the most useful things, I think, of any standard that we could look at, is just looking at the table of contents and knowing which sections really apply to us. So for us, we're going to be looking at the acronyms and definitions, the basic conditions for a fire. We'll look at some of the different flammable gases and different groups. Then we'll look at, in this class, ventilation and adjacent areas and the use of combustible gas detection. We won't have too much time to cover the kind of the most used section, which is section 10, because this section in particular is where you would find all of the depictions for how to classify each piece of equipment on a production or drilling area. So section 10 is kind of the bulk of where you would want to go if you were designing a platform or if you're putting a new piece of equipment onto an area class drawing. And really, if you know section 5, section 6, and section 10 of API 500, that really takes you an extremely far way. Everything else in this document is important, of course, but it's almost like it's just further clarification of the sections that you might already know. So if you know 4, 5, and 6, and 10, then you can pretty much by association know how to classify MODUs in 11 and some of the general applications in 8. Okay, but we, again, we'll start with the definitions. That's on page 4. Okay, obviously all these definitions are important, but in this class, we're whittled down to an hour, so we're going to try to cover the most important ones. And the most important I can think of is what is the definition for Class 1 Div 1 and Class 1 Div 2. So a Class 1 Div 1 location, I'll just read this verbatim, a location in which ignitable concentrations of gas are expected to exist under normal operating conditions, or in which facility operation of equipment or process might simultaneously release flammable gases or vapors and also cause the failure of electrical equipment. Okay, so that's interesting because they're saying not only is it a location where it exists under normal operating conditions, but also where if there's an actual faulty piece of equipment that causes a failure of electrical equipment, you got to call that Class 1 Div 1 too. I haven't seen a ton of examples that that meet that second criteria. Class 1 Div 2, a location in which flammable gases or vapors may be present, but normally are confined within a closed system. An example of that would be a pressure vessel. You definitely have hazardous gases and vapors present in the vessel, but they're normally contained within the system. It'd be abnormal for that pressure vessel to not do its job and to have a leak. So we're going to constitute a pressure vessel as only a Class 1 Div 2 location. It's also a location where it's adjacent, like we looked earlier, to a Division 1 location. Okay, so let's compare that. We know about class and division, but how does that compare to API 505? Well, let's see. So here's a cool little table that I have in the course guide that kind of shows you the differences between class division and zone. Now, before we get into that, a lot of times we just take the word class for granted. We always just say class 1, class 1, class 1. And it's always class 1. And we're always talking about class 1 when we're talking about an offshore environment. And the reason why is because class 1 is the most conservative, right? So if you're talking about class 1 for a flammable or for a ignitable atmosphere, you're talking about the most conservative way to classify a platform. And we have gases and vapors offshore. So we're already classifying the platform to the most conservative way. Yes, we might have situations on the platform where there are dust or fibers, but if we classify it to dust and fibers, it would be less conservative than if we were to classify the platform to gas and vapor. So that's why you really only hear about class 1 in the offshore environment. Everything is class 1 because we're always... Okay, so now that we know what class means, and class is common to both API 500 and 505, and we already know what division means. So what are zones? Okay, so zones are for API 505. It's for matching up with the IEC standard. And a zone 0 is the most dangerous place. It's where a hazardous gases are present continuously or for long periods of time under normal operating conditions. Zone 1 is gas just being a little less likely to be around than at zone 0. And zone 2 is where it's not likely to exist under the normal circumstances. And so there you have it. So that's the big difference between API 500 and 505. Another thing I want to bring to everyone's attention, though, that a lot of people might not know is that equipment is, electrical equipment will always, if you're going to install it inside of a classified location, it will always have a label on it that tells you that it's that location. So for example, if you have a pressure transmitter and you put it into a class 1 div 2 location, you can go and look on the tag for that pressure transmitter and it'll say some type of NRDL, nationally recognized testing laboratory like UL or FM, and it'll say, I'm good for class 1 div 2. And the other thing it'll say is it'll give a group. And by group, I mean a letter, A, B, C, or D, or A, B, C, and D, okay? And so what that's telling you is that it's not only rated for the division, but it's rated for the gas or ignitable thing that is going to be in that division. And they classify these different types of flammable gases into 4 different groups in the 500. And those groups are A, B, C, D. And A is for acetylene and other similar gases. B is for hydrogen, which is important, especially in battery storage. And C is for hydrogen sulfide, especially important in our mobile facilities, and also hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons are group D, hydrogen sulfide C, hydrogen B, and acetylene A. So it is pretty common for transmitters and other measurement devices and pretty much all electrical devices offshore, it's common for them to be rated for each group, A, B, C, and D. So it'll say like A through D. But it definitely occurs offshore that engineers will specify a particular instrument or electrical device that is only really good for Group D, because that is the bulk of what we encounter offshore. I mean, for example, if you're putting a transmitter in an area that doesn't have welding, it doesn't have a battery box, and it's not an H2S platform, then you're really going to be okay with Group D. As inspectors, what the important takeaway is that if you're on an H2S platform, if you're in a battery room, and you see a device that's only for Group D, you need to raise the alarm that this device is not rated for the area. Okay, and then similarly, API 505 has the same kind of thing. The only difference is that they combine hydrogen and acetylene into this 2C group, and hydrogen sulfides in Group 2B, and hydrocarbons are in 2A. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. So again, if y'all have any questions about just those basic definitions of API 500, please let me know. If not, we'll move on to some other key terms that are in API 500. And that would be just the basic conditions for a fire. So I kind of have this better illustrated in the course guide, but I want everybody to know that basically tells you the basic conditions for a fire. And if you wanted to read it there, it's absolutely there for you to read. But a lot of us just know it by the fire triangle, which I think I put here. Everybody kind of pretty much already knows that you need an ignition source, you need fuel, and you need oxygen in order for a fire. And of course, there's always the tetrahedron version, which talks about chemical reactions, which do sometimes apply offshore as well. What is the important takeaway is that the fuel, or in our case, the hazardous gas, needs to be in a concentration which is ignitable. And I keep saying that, ignitable concentrations. But what does that mean? It means that it has to constitute 5% or 15% of the atmosphere at the time. So the atmosphere has to be 5% natural gas for there to be an ignitable atmosphere, given a certain volume, right? So we don't really use that a lot, but it's just important to know that it only is 5%. But you can have an atmosphere that is completely filled with gas, and it's not ignitable. And that's kind of like, that explains why you might want to keep oxygen out of a tank, right? You want it to be either all gas or all some inert gas like nitrogen, right? You never want to mix the fuel and the oxygen in the same tank. So, okay, so we don't typically use that 5%, 15% rule, right? We usually talk about the lower explosive limit, or LEL, right? And when we talk about LEL, we're talking about 0 to 5%, right? So 100% LEL is 5% gas by volume. So that's just an important distinction to know. Some people might get really nervous when they hear, "Oh my goodness, you've got 30% LEL," but in reality, you would still need to go all the way up to 100% LEL just to have an ignitable atmosphere. Okay, so I wanted to talk about conditions for fire, key terms. I'll again just bring up this drawing just so that we can look at it again with the basic knowledge we know. We'll look at, like, for example, this test separator, right? The reason why this is a 10-foot radius of class 1 div 2, the single hash marks, is because we know that that pressure vessel will normally contain the gas, right? So it would be an abnormal circumstance for there to be gas in that area. So we're creating a division 2 area around this tank. There are other different types of process equipment that is classified differently, like control panels, well control panels, chemical pumps, chemical tanks, battery boxes, all have their own designation for area class, and you can find those in Section 8 and Section 10 of API 500. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the term adequate ventilation. I think we all kind of have an idea of what adequate ventilation means, but API 500 is extremely specific when they talk about adequate ventilation. Let me just get there in the text. Okay, so they give a very specific definition of what it means to have ventilation in general, and then they give a more specific definition of what it means to have adequate ventilation. And the thing I want to highlight is that adequate ventilation is easy to understand if you understand this one rule, and that is that if you have adequate ventilation, you can never have a concentration of gas over 25% LEL. Okay, so they had to put the threshold somewhere, and they put it at 25% LEL. So if there's any situation where gas can accumulate in an enclosure over 25% LEL, you do not have adequate ventilation within that enclosure. And that is, again, the specific definition of inadequately ventilated areas. It just doesn't meet the provisions of 6.3.2, which tells you you need to never be able to accumulate 25%. Now, they give you different methods for achieving the adequate ventilation. You can use mechanical methods where you actually are forcibly exchanging air at a certain rate, 6 air changes per hour specifically, or you can do certain things with the walls of the building and louvers where you create natural ventilation. But either way, the simple definition after it's all said and done is can gas accumulate at 25% LEL? Okay, that's important to know, especially as we move into the next section, which talks about adjacent areas. And this section, it actually talks about adjacent areas when, in the context of when you have buildings or enclosures. So we're going to look at each building and each enclosure on this page because it's important for not only this discussion, but the next discussion for when we talk about gas detectors. Okay, so we'll start with the top left corner. We've got a building here. The building does not have vapor-tight barriers, meaning gas can pass through, but the building is adequately ventilated. This is one of the most rare cases that you would see on an area classification drawing. Can't think of very many buildings that are non-vapor tight and adequately ventilated. Excuse me. And so you don't see this very often, but when you do see it, it's interesting. So what happens is the area classification just passes right through, and the classification within the enclosure itself pretty much remains unchanged. Let's compare that to a situation where you have an enclosed area that's not adequately ventilated, that touches a Class 1 Div 1 area and does not have a vapor-tight barrier. So this would be an example of when you have like a building and you have, let's say, a door close to this corner that opens up to this Division 1 area. Well, now the whole darn enclosure is Class 1 Div 1. And that's tough because now you got to put all the electrical equipment in there. It's got to be in like NEMA 7 enclosures, and it's extremely expensive and heavy. And it's going to be tough to specify all of the electrical equipment in that building to be rated for the area. So that's not a good situation. The next situation is where you have a vapor-tight barrier. And this is a more common scenario that you'll see on area class drawings. So any type of connex building is in general designed to be vapor-tight. So most of the quarters you see offshore are exactly as you'd expect to be vapor-tight. And when you have a vapor-tight area with no doors that hit this classified area, you can consider everything inside the enclosure to be unclassified, which is excellent in terms of installing electrical equipment because you can use general purpose electrical equipment, just like you would use in your house. And then this last example is analogous to the above top right corner. It's just that the enclosure is only touching a class 1 div 2 area. And we'll come back to this specific instance in a second when we talk about gas detection. Okay, any questions so far? We've gone over adequate ventilation and adjacent areas. So I'm just gonna take a quick look, take a sip of water. Okay, so the next section talks about combustible gas detection. All right, I'm gonna preface this with saying that combustible gas detection is a requirement of API 500 in a very particular case. But by and large, the only reason why you'd be installing a gas detector on your facility is because it's a requirement of API 14C, not API 500. So API 14C makes you install gas detectors in a number, and Adobe failed on. Okay. So in 14C and Appendix C, they give the requirements for when you need combustible gas detection. They say you need it in A, all enclosed areas that are class 1 div 1 or div 2. Next, they talk about all enclosed areas that contain a natural gas fueled prime mover. And C, in buildings where personnel regularly or occasionally sleep that contain a flammable gas source. So if you're reading 14C, it's telling you exactly where you need gas detectors. Now, what do those gas detectors have to do? Well, it goes on, and it says that you have to alarm when you have 25% LEL, and you have to automatically perform a corrective action. For example, close an SDV, shut in the process, and shut down electrical power to equipment that's not suitable for locations classified as hazardous. And when do you do that? You do that at 60% LEL. So keep that number in your head, 60% LEL, and note how interesting it is that you'd be disconnecting electrical power to equipment that is not suitable for locations. Okay. Put that in the back of your head and then 500. Okay. API 500 has its own gas detection section, but it's talking about something completely different than what API 14F is saying. So API 500 is not saying that you have to install a gas detector. It is not a requirement of API 500. But it is saying that if you have a very particular situation, you might want to use a gas detector because it'll give you an advantage. All right, so what situation is that? It is this situation specifically, okay? They're talking about when you have a building that is adjacent to an area that's class 1 div 2, specifically class 1 div 2, not class 1 div 1. If you have an area that's adjacent to a class 1 div 2, if you have an enclosure that's adjacent to a class 1 div 2 area, and you have and the building is otherwise vapor tight, but you have one section of the building, like a window or a door, and that door just happens to be in that stinking class 1 div 2 area. It's like, ah, man, now I got this door and it's in this class 1 div 2 area. So now I got to classify the whole dang building as class 1 div 2. API 500 is giving you some relief. They're saying, look, if you install a gas detector and it meets this criteria, then you don't have to classify this whole section as division 2. You can just keep it as unclassified. And you say, okay, great, I'd like to do that. So you go and you put some gas detectors in your building, and the building becomes unclassified, and you just follow the rules. So what are the rules? The rules are that A, it's a permanent gas detector. B, the gas detector is a nationally recognized testing laboratory gas detector. C, you have an adequate number to detect gas, blah, blah, blah. And D, that at 20% LEL, you have a local alarm. Okay, let's compare that. So 20% alarm in API 500 But when we go to 14C, what did it say? It said 25% LEL. So there's a difference. Okay, back to 500. Sensing a gas concentration of 40% LEL, the gas detector should activate an alarm, both audio and visual, and initiate automatic disconnection of power from all electrical devices in the area that are not suitable for Division 2. Okay, but the disconnection device itself needs to be actually rated for Class 1 Div 1. All right, so what are the differences when we talk about API 14C and 500? Number one, 14C is saying that you need gas detectors in all of these locations. API 500 is not saying you need them. API 500 is just saying in the specific case where you have a door adjacent to a Division 2 area, you can put a gas detector, and then that can derate the area to unclassified. So now that you put that in there, it needs to meet this criteria, and the criteria is that it has to shut down all the electrical equipment at 40% LEL. Notice how API 500 does not make you shut in your process at 40% LEL. It just makes you shut in the electrical equipment. And then I want to bring up an abnormality of API 14C because it doesn't make sense when it says that if you have concentrations over 60%, you have to shut power to equipment not suitable for locations classified as hazardous. So the reason it doesn't make any sense is because you're not allowed to install equipment in a hazardous location that's not rated for the area. API 14F says that that's illegal. Our regulations say that that's illegal, right? So you can't do that. So there is no situation where you'd ever be disconnecting power because 14C told you to, because you never are able to install equipment not rated for the area in any case, okay? The one exception is given to you in API 500. So in API 500, you can classify a building that would otherwise be Class 1 Div 2 as unclassified. And if you do that, then you might want to make all of the equipment in there general purpose equipment. But if you do that, then the gas detector in that building needs to shut that equipment down at 40% LEL, not 60, but 40. So that's been an area where a lot of confusion has happened over the years, and I wanted to try to clear that up as best I can. But if y'all have any questions about that, let me know, because in my mind, there's some mistakes and some inconsistencies between 14C and 500, and it's hard to kind of navigate through what they're trying to tell you to do there. Okay. The next thing I'll go over is just take a jacket. So we could go over section 10 if we had enough time, and we could go over every single piece of production and drilling equipment that you'll see on API 500 platforms. I actually do that in the longer version of this class, but in today's class, I just want to really go over some particular points that are often forgotten, and specifically filters. So here's one of the more interesting statements that's given in API 500. And it says that a gas scrubber that's in non-fuel service is just to be classified like a pressure vessel, which is a Class 1 Div 2 area. But then it says a gas filter separator in non-fuel service should be classified like a launcher. And as we all might know, launchers, I spell that right, are classified more conservatively than pressure vessels. They are classified with a 5-foot Class 1 Div 1 area and a 10-foot Class 1 Div 2, okay? And we can speculate as to the reason why. I think it's because you have routinely, or you may routinely open that pig launcher and release hazardous gas, and that's on a routine basis. You could say that's similar to a filter, because a filter, especially in a process service or non-fuel service, is meant to capture solids, and then it has to be changed. Differential pressure builds up across that filter. So because you're changing that filter,
sorry about that. We just got a 5-minute notice. It will be ending. It's an abrupt ending, but we can get back on it if we need to. Just bear with me. We can you'll just sign back in if we need to come back into it.
Okay, and I will try to finish up in these next 5 minutes too. But just going to say that similarly, a filter would need to be changed out maybe on a routine basis, and therefore you are creating a Class 1 Div 1 area similar to a pig launcher. And then just to speculate why they didn't say that a fuel service filter is the same and is less conservative on that is because fuel service is probably a lot cleaner and changed a lot less frequently. There's a lot less solids in maybe the fuel gas that you might be using. Okay. A real quick note about API 500 second edition versus third edition. The third edition is much more conservative because it takes into account the pressure at which gas might be released. So, and then they apply a multiplier to the size of the area. So to use an example, if you have a test separator that would normally have a 10-foot Div 2 location, but that test separator operates at 2200 PSI or above 1800 PSI, you would have to put like a 2 times multiplier or 3 times multiplier on that 10-foot area. So now instead of a 10-foot Class 1 Div 2, you have a 30-foot Class 1 Div 2. So definitely pay particular attention to that on new platforms such as like Vito. I know Lake Jackson has a new platform coming in. I forget the name of it. But definitely pay attention because they actually have to classify their platform to the third edition of API 500. And the last thing I want to point out, and I know I might get cut off in the middle of explaining this, but the third edition of API 500 does have a different way of classifying flotation cells. And this is a point of emphasis for me because I've noticed that a lot of flotation cells have leaking gaskets. And finally, API 500 has recognized that really this is a situation where gas is normally present. So they are classifying flotation cells with a 5-foot Class 1 Div 1 area and 10-foot Class 1 Div 2. I'd encourage all engineers who are reviewing these area classification drawings to take that into account and even maybe suggest to operators that they reevaluate their tanks, especially if they have leaking gaskets, to ensure that they meet the proper area classification. Class 1 Div 1 would be, in my mind, a more appropriate classification for flotation cells, given the incidence of gas release that we've had through the gaskets offshore. Okay, and then that's it. That's all I have. But if y'all have any questions, I'm definitely willing to take those. And if y'all need the quiz link, I'm going to repost that now in the chat. And you guys can go in and take that quiz. And then again, if you have questions, just come back and let me know. I'll hang on the line. Or just give me a chat or call me at any time, and I can answer any questions you might have, or try to at least. For API 500, I'm definitely willing to do that. And any questions you have about electrical in general, I think I've addressed a lot of them. So just give me a call, and I'll see if I can help you. But anyway, I'm very grateful that I got to do this, and thank y'all so much for listening in.
Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate it, man. Great job as usual.
Thanks.
The last couple minutes, any questions? Sounds like that's a no. Everybody have a great day and be careful out there.